all on the book My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. I actually was cornered by Alexis and asked to do this, and I hadn't read the book yet. And I decided to pick this and then was like, ooh, this is a great book, but I don't know if I can talk about it without giving away spoilers. So here's your alert now. I'm going to be going through the whole book. There's going to be spoilers. If you decide to read it, my interpretation may be helpful for your own interpretation because the ending is rather obscure, but I think I put the pieces together. And also talking with other people on forums, we think we put the pieces. So let's just dive right in. A little bit just briefly about Stephen Graham Jones. He is Native American, so a lot of the books he's written have a spin with Native American culture. So this book is about horror movies, slasher films, but it has a spin because it also has components of culture and gentrification and other elements of basically historical marginalization of Native American people. So, just to start off with, I put a few quotes that I liked in this book at the very beginning. Some girls just don't know how to die. I feel like I'm one of those. If anyone out here has a lot of grit, I feel like this applies to you. And for this book, I feel like there's a lot of female figures that this applies to as well, especially your main character. Horror is not a symptom, it's a love affair. Part of why I brought some of my props today, I am a huge fan of horror. I have a huge collection, as Alexis do. Anyone else like horror? Yeah, okay, got a couple, okay. So I am a huge fan of horror movies, horror books, anything, since I was a kid. I mean, I think I watched Jaws when I was like 3 or 4 years old. So this has been a part of my life. Even thinking about older horror movies going back to like the 1920s and before that. So it's just a huge part of my life. So talking a little bit about the plot summary, it kind of goes into it pretty quick. It starts off with these characters, Lot and Sven. They're from the Netherlands. They're visiting this remote town in Iowa, and they decide to take a skinny dip in Indian Lake, which is in this small town. And it starts off, if you think of Jaws, if you've seen that, a couple kids just messing around, skinny dipping. And what happens is they're murdered horrifically in a boat on the lake.
Did they talk about why they're in Iowa when they come from the Netherlands?
So they're just traveling there. They don't actually say why. I think it was more of like they were maybe in school or like a trip like that, because they're pretty young, like college age. And I will say, Stephen Graham Jones, the author, he is, I believe, from Iowa, so that's why this area was picked, because he knows a lot about the landscape and can describe a lot of that. It then immediately switches to our main character, which is Jade, or Jennifer Daniels is her full name. And she's 17 years old, and she's obsessed with slashers, just like I am. And the interesting thing too with this book is the writing style for her. It took me a little bit to get into how he was writing, how she talked, and how she thinks, because she is a teenager, so there's a lot of run-on sentences. So be prepared for kind of this hyperactive, just kind of flow of thoughts, if you will, that she has very rapidly, but it does convey her age and somewhat immaturity, I guess you could say. Another piece of this is she is this kind of dark, emo punk, rejected kid. They talk a little bit about her Native American background as well and how that makes her so she doesn't fit in with some of the other people in town. In the very beginning of the book, she's actually dyeing her hair, I believe, with shoe polish or some sort. And talking about, I think she ended up doing that because the kit didn't work on native hair, so the actual hair dyeing kit. So just kind of really speaking to some of the cultural differences and individual differences. Her father's name is Cat Daniels, and he's basically the town reject as well. He is a drunk, no one seems to like him, the sheriff dislikes him, and he also hangs out with a group of people, primarily the next character, Rexall, who's one of his best friends, who's really kind of sexually deviant, and again, people don't like him, and he's a janitor at like a middle school. It's not a good character in terms of, it's not something you want to socialize with. And so she talks a lot about being a marginalized person. So she doesn't really have a close relationship with her father, and her mother isn't in the picture. She lives in town, but the mother is pretty much absent from her life. And basically, out of rebellion, she goes out at night and kind of just does what she wants. And the book opens with her going out at night, and she comes across some construction workers who are basically hanging out after work later at night. They are basically being paid to stay in the town because they're building this subdivision called Canandaigua, which is basically a subdivision across the lake. In order to get to it, you have to cross by boat. So it's very elite. The houses are huge, and a lot of the people in the town don't like that it's being built there because it's taken like historically native land and basically taken advantage of the area. Basically she's out there and she meets some of them, and one of the guys in Shooting Glasses, they don't actually have full names, they have just descriptor names. So Shooting Glasses, we'll talk about him more later. He drives her to where she wants to go because they were kind of concerned that this young girl is out at night. So he drives her to this pier, and then basically he's asking her some questions and she feels pretty uncomfortable. So she ends up jumping into the same boat that those two characters I mentioned, Sven and Lot, in the beginning. She jumps into the boat that they were in and attempts suicide. Well, she had the suicide attempt, and then basically, this was so odd, but I suppose it's true pending the town, she actually was required then to complete community service because she stole public property taking the boat. So she had to engage in community service, and she was being monitored by Sheriff Hardy, and his daughter also died in happenstance in the lake years earlier. She also works as a janitor. However, when she attempted suicide and she got all her belongings back from jail and from having to do community service now and working with the sheriff, there was a phone in the boat. And they thought it was her phone, but it wasn't. It was actually Lot's phone that she was recording her and her boyfriend when they were killed. So Jade opens up this phone, she manages to hack it and get into it, and finds a video that they recorded of basically both of them getting murdered in kind of obscure imaging, like because it's dark and boats moving and all of that. And so then all of a sudden she realizes that she thinks, based on all the events that are happening with the things happening with the town construction, and now that there's the murder of these two, it's kind of like the initial sacrifice that's needed to make the start of a slasher film. So that's kind of what kicks this whole thing off. Throughout the whole book, there's the focus on several different things in terms of indigenous population. So the first is indigenous displacement, is a huge theme throughout this book. They talk about the cultural displacement with this idea of the lake witch being this young girl. And we'll talk more about the lake witch shortly with the overall plot. But the lake witch is Stacy Graves. It's a young girl, and she was Native. Her mother was Native American, and it's believed that her father was the sheriff when the town was first built. And so she was basically kind of rejected by being this illegitimate child of the sheriff. And also just the racism connotations as well with Native Americans and white people. And so there's this idea of that the town, as they were colonialized, they started baptizing and really infiltrating Christianity. And so then Indians over time were displaced. So we get a lot of things of that in this book, along with just cultural traditions being replaced over time as well. It also explores the gentrification process. So basically we're looking at urban people moving in, attracting new businesses, but basically the current inhabitants are being displaced. And that's a real theme, especially with her family being part of the low income side of the town. So oftentimes just the number of kids in school, things like that, you can see the cultural shift in socioeconomic status and people slowly being pushed out job-wise. And like her father, I believe, was working for construction, but then he was being unemployed because they were bringing in other people and kind of pushing out the locals from the business. Let's see here, what else is I at here? Yeah, and I mentioned this or alluded to it earlier. So Terranova, the new construction subdivision, if you will, there's a lot of anger towards the elites who are building it, because there's basically about maybe 8 of them that are building these rich, expensive homes, and they're basically disrespecting the natural forest and pushing things away. A lot of the existing historical settlement places, if you will, of indigenous people. So, as she starts to suspect that there is a slasher cycle in place, she starts to begin looking for things that suggest more about the slasher cycle. And we're going to talk about that as well, because throughout this book, there's, at the end of each chapter, is something called Slasher 101, where they basically educate you on slasher movies. And I will just add another thing, which we'll talk about, but this book is full of movie references. So there's a lot, like hundreds probably. So you have to have a little bit of understanding of movies. I had to Google a lot if I didn't know a movie to check to see what the reference was, because it makes a lot more sense when you know the movie references. So she meets Letha Mondrag when she comes back to school after her suicide attempt, because she was in the hospital for 7 weeks. So she came back at the end of the semester. Everyone thought that Jade wasn't going to graduate, so they were surprised to see her back and that she was in the count for graduation. And she's in the bathroom and she meets Letha Mondrag. And she thinks that Letha is the final girl. Just all her personality pieces, how she looks, just different aspects of her character. And then there's also this piece of Letha is also Black or African American, and she is wondering, well, how's this going to work? Because historically in slashers, the Black character doesn't survive, and we were talking about this. Yeah. So I put a couple references here because Keith David on the top up there, he's one of my favorite actors, and he was in the thing. He's probably considered the first Black character to survive a horror movie. Some people say that it's Dwayne Jones, but Dwayne Jones technically dies at the end. So it depends on how you define it. So I guess people who are saying Dwayne Jones is the first person they were speaking to that he wasn't eaten by zombies. But I don't know. I'm sticking with Keith David. And then LL Cool J, which is the third picture in Deep Blue Sea. He was selected for the role, but he said, I'm not taking it if you're going to kill me off, because according to the script, you're going to kill me off. So they changed the script so that he would be in it and wouldn't be killed off. And then the last one I threw on was Ice Cube, because he was in Anaconda and he also didn't die. And I'm sure there are more, but these are a couple of the notable ones. Not too many more. I feel like there's a couple new movies now, but maybe not.
No. Well, there was Dwayne in Scream.
Yes.
But he technically don't count because he left.
That's
and
true.
then came back at the end of the movie.
That's true. Yeah.
He said Black people died.
Yeah. And I was trying to find female Black characters. I don't know any
No,
female
they all
Black
died.
characters.
But,
Yeah.
what's her name was in Freddy versus Jason.
Yeah, Kelly Rowland. Yeah, she. Yeah.
He killed her. Right.
Yeah, I was hoping she was gonna live, and then no. So, but Jade believes that Letha portrays all these qualities that what makes you a final girl. You know.
Can you
yeah.
talk about what is a final?
We're gonna get into that shortly.
Okay.
Yeah. So Letha views. However, so let me back up here. So Jade is trying to tell Letha that she's this final girl, but she doesn't want to sound crazy. So she's trying to send her things and basically hint to her, and she ends up creating a package and tries to make it concealed so that people don't suspect what it is. And then there's an essay in there with all her Slasher 101 essays, which we'll talk about, and basically trying to convince her that she's the final girl. Well, Letha views these attempts, and when she reads this essay from Jade, she actually thinks that it's a projection of sexual abuse. And so she calls the police, and the police get involved again. And so it's denied throughout the book that Jade was sexually abused by her father, but we'll talk about this with the ending as well, because that's part of the ending. Letha believes that Jade copes with her traumatic experiences through horror films and what she sees in horror films. Especially how a lot of times there's like this revenge motive within a lot of slasher films on the slasher's end. So let me see what's in here. Oh yeah. So another thing as well with this slasher cycle plot is the town has a history. There's a camp, which is informally called Camp Blood, where a bunch of children were killed. And they actually go into the history of that in the book, in the Slasher 101, because she does interviews with people in nursing homes and folks around the town to support what happened. And in fact, you find out that the sheriff was actually a young boy who was there when it happened. He was around 10 or 11 years old. She thinks though that this is all tied back in some way to Camp Blood and this legend of the Lake Witch, Stacy Graves, and it was rumored at the time that the Camp Blood murders were caused by the Lake Witch coming out and killing the children, because there were some very bizarre, I guess you could say, possession type of elements where another child was possessed and then was stabbing another kid. There was a ton of murders in a single night. So Jade thinks that this is part of a cycle, and so she's trying to convey this to Letta, but Letta doesn't see it. So this is a little poem that reminded me of Nightmare on Elm Street. This is when she goes to one of the nursing homes to find out more about the Lake Witch. This is the poem that the elderly lady says to her. Stacy, Stacy, Stacy Graves, born to put you in your grave. You see her in the dark of night, and once you do, you're lost from sight. Look for water, look for blood, look for footprints in the mud. You never see her walk on grass. Don't slow down, she'll get your... So I thought that was a fun little quote. Alright, so this is where we kind of get into spoilers here, and we'll talk a little bit more as well about the final girl, because I'm going to talk about the Slasher 101 as separate from the summary of the book, because it's kind of its own element, really. So when I first closed this book, I was like, I don't know what actually happened at the end of this. And I had to go back and like reread a bunch of things and then write down and put down plot notes to piece everything together, because he purposely keeps it kind of obscure. So the first overarching plot, as we've been talking about, is Stacy Graves, the Lake Witch. So what I put together was from one of the nursing home residents. The original ghost was actually considered to be Stacy Graves' mother. But then over time, it became the child. So there's also some thoughts that this might be similar to how urban legends are built, where it starts with something and then there's a little bit of a transformation over time. Jade, talking to the nursing home members, found that the mother, it was believed that the mother would wander the shores looking for the daughter because she couldn't find her missing daughter. And she would take kids and then nurse them with poison milk to kill them. So that's the original urban legend. And then they talk about that Stacy herself, so this is what I put together, is I believe that the daughter was killed, but it's also unclear if she was actually killed or missing, or because they talk about her a little bit like she's alive at some points, but then when they talk about her death, it seems like she's been killed for longer. So Stacy either died on a large fishing hook, because they talk about with the transportation from one side of land to the other, back in the old days, what they would do is they would hunt elk, and they would shoot the elk, but the only way they could get it across was if they float the elk. So they talk about how they'll plug the nostrils and inflate the body with air to pull the elk across. Well, in one particular incident, one of the elk, they didn't plug the hole properly and the elk sunk. And the man who shot the elk didn't want the elk to go to waste. So he came back with a fishing hook to get it out and drag it from on the bottom of the lake. So they get this elk out, and they're trying to pull it to mainland, but when they put the elk in, they pull out a girl, and the hook is in her jaw, and she has this black blood kind of falling out of her mouth and her face. So this is where I'm not sure if she was alive or dead, because it sounds like her corpse might have been at the bottom of the lake, and they found it, and she was dead already. So I'm suspecting that she was killed, and that, yes, the mother might have been the first urban legend looking for her child, and the child was murdered somewhere on the bottom of the lake. That's what I think. But again, this is all my thoughts because it's very obscure. They talk about when Stacy was around 8 years old, so back about 100 years ago. They talk about how local boys would play witch with her, and they swung her onto the lake to prove that she wasn't a witch. But, because witches, float where they sink, right? They float if you're a witch. However, the water doesn't let her in, and she floats. And what we find out later is that there was a famous minister, if you will, that they brought into the town, and he baptized the lake, if you will. So she couldn't go in the water because there was this conflict with religion. So she floated. And it's described that she runs off like a wild animal, if you will. I think it's on the next slide here. Yeah. So she runs off on all fours, and this is significant because it comes back later. So she runs off on all fours to try to find her mother. That's what they believe. So again, I'm not sure at the time if her mother was already dead or if her mother was alive when this particular incident with the children happened. Because they also later on mentioned that the sheriff at the time, 100 years ago, makes a comment of, oh, we can put this body where we put the others, I put her body where the buzzards can't go, which is basically a cave, and we're going to come back. Yeah, here it is, yeah, where the buzzards cannot find them, to draw attention. So they think that she was looking for her, she ran off to find her mother, but her mother has been deceased, so she's kind of like this animal child, if you will, kind of running around, but then at the same time, she can't penetrate the water of the lake. And then throughout this book, because again, there's themes with Jade's own father, so it's believed that this is part of that projection of her relationship with her own father, along with her father really hates the sheriff, and so he calls him deputy all the time, and this is this idea of that he's projecting like a similar relationship to what happened 100 years ago between the Indians and the sheriff again, so it's the same dynamic repeated over and over again. So Stacy's unable to get into the water because Ezekiel is the name of the minister, and he sings this holy song. There was a flood in the town when he brought all the people into the church to keep them safe from the water as much as possible, and the church ultimately sank in the lake. It got flooded. And supposedly, the story goes, is that they were singing prayer while the church was sinking into the lake. And so the idea is that the lake is now baptized from the people who died as they were drowning in the lake. That is why she cannot penetrate the water, because he did not tolerate witchcraft or anything different from Christianity. So that's where that comes from. And then the sheriff I mentioned earlier, when he was around 10 years old, he was actually at Camp Blood. And so they talk a little bit about the murders in detail, what happens with each children. There's about 8 children involved that were killed. And he almost was killed, but he survived. However, he said that he remembers the lake witch trying to pull him out of the water. Like he ran to the water and hid underneath it, and she was trying to pull him out to get him and kill him with the other children. However, when he told that to the police and the adults, they didn't believe him. And so what he remembers them telling him is, oh, yeah, that's what you think you experienced, but you didn't actually experience that. It was a crazed child, basically. It was, it was a rampage. It was nothing supernatural at all. Just, an unfortunate circumstance. But basically they're influencing him as adults to change his testimony, even though he, on some level, knows that this is what happened. And I mention this because in a moment here we're going to talk about the ending sequence as well. So what I've figured out from all of this is Stacy runs away from the town and the people who hurt her, and she's looking for her mother who's hidden in the caves because the sheriff killed her mother and buried her in a cave where the buzzards can't go. She finds the body, and she decides to stay in that cave with her mother, and the water gradually seeps in, and eventually that hook finds her mouth with the elk and pulls her out. So whether or not she's dead or alive, I'm pretty sure she's dead. I think she went in there and she died with her mother. So she's getting pulled out, and that's the thing too with her, is she has a missing jaw, so that's like her scary element, is she has this jaw that's ripped off. So that's where her jaw gets removed. She then, as a ghost, goes to find her mother again, but find a better cave, because mind you, this is like 100 years ago, so this is like the urban legend history. So she goes to find another cave higher up. This cave is then disrupted by a fire, which Camp Blood, when that massacre happened, they were lighting fires. Kids were being troublemakers. They lit up a fire, and that really made her angry. So she goes to Camp Blood and she murders the children that are there. And then that's when she tries to grab the sheriff, who was young at the time, can't do it. So then Stacy returns to the cave. Years go by. Now we have the construction workers who are building for the subdivision, Terra Nova. And they mention one of the construction workers, Grayson, they are building one of the main founders' houses, and they are digging, and a shallow pit opens, and he falls, and it's basically a shallow cave, if you will, that's under the rock. And he falls in, and he starts acting like he's possessed. Shooting glasses describes him as walking on all fours, his animalistic instinct, and he's never the same once they pull him out. In fact, one of the head founders tries to cover it up by putting him in a care facility, and he eventually dies. So Jade believes that when this happened, this was around the time when the Dutch young couple was swimming in the water. And so she thinks that the witch then went and killed that group, and then again retreated back to where she came from. So then she finds her next cave, because that cave has been disrupted. And there's this whole long story about a lot of dead elk, but basically with the new town Canandaigua being built, there's a lot of animals that they're finding that are killed, and they thought that it was actually the construction, but now that she's putting the pieces together, she actually thinks that it's the lake witch and some of the disruptions that are happening. But they end up piling up, the construction workers in the town pile up the dead elk into kind of like a cave-like structure. And basically they think that the witch goes there, because later on when she actually sees the witch for the first time, when Jade sees her, she actually has elk fur on her. So she thinks that those pieces are from this next cave that she tried to hide in. However, that cave gets disrupted again, and Leth and Jade, and I'll explain why they're trying to escape, but because there's 3 plots here, so you have to bear with me, because they all intertangle. There's no way to talk about them without talking about them separately. And that's what I said when I sat down to talk about this book. I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to talk about this in like straight line, because it's not. It's all over. So there's a second plot, which is the next one, which we're going to talk about Theo, which is Leth's father, but he's basically a murderer, so we're going to come back to that. But basically, they're hiding from him, and they disrupt Stacy's elk dead body cave. Okay, and then Stacy then goes on this boat and has a killing spree there, and that's probably like the goriest thing in the book, because it's really gory, just people getting ripped apart and stuff. It's pretty gory. And then she's not stopped there. She goes to, the town has this big 4th of July party on the lake where they watch horror movies and stuff on this big projector on the lake. So Stacy basically goes to town there and kills a bunch of the party goers. And Jade is also there trying to stop this whole thing again. And she starts to notice that Stacy floats on the water. And that's when she starts figuring out that she can't penetrate the water. So they get into this battle, if you will, where Jade is fighting her and kind of going under the water to try to prevent her from grabbing her. And she's also thinking about, okay, her jaw was ripped off by a hook, so there's got to be something that's like her weakness. You know, what's the final boss battle weakness? So she's like, well, I don't have an iron hook, but she decides that she's going to try to take off her jaw, and basically that's what she does. Is she manages to like rip her jaw off, and that basically kills the ghost. So. And she talks about in here that a lot of the final girls have some type of rage that comes out at the end of the movie, which has them kill the slasher. Like, think of Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween. There's like this rage that's just pent up, and then they're able to win at the end. So that's believed to be related to that Jade's actually the final girl, not Letha, and that she's channeling that rage to take out the final slasher. All right. Second plot, the grizzly bear. So when all these murders and things are going on with the elk being killed, and there's that cave elk, they don't know what's causing it. They're like, is it the construction workers? Is it something else? Is it some type of environmental issue? Is it a grizzly bear? They're not sure. So it's believed that there's this aggressive grizzly bear, because one of the elite founders of Terranova, Deacon Samuels, he's found killed at the site where Camp Blood used to be. It's now just an abandoned cabin grounds, if you will. And so they end up finding that Jade at first thinks that Deacon's murder is part of the slasher plot, But actually, he was just doing some reckless things in the woods, and he got attacked by an aggressive bear. And she didn't believe that at first, but at the very end of the book, she ends up seeing the aggressive bear. She had when she was trying to get away from Letha's father during his attack, they end up seeing that cave and they retreat into there, which is when they disrupt it, and when Stacy then goes and kills people on the boat. But she accidentally sets it on fire. She was trying to get the whole thing had like collapsed on them, so she was trying to get out, and she accidentally started a fire in this process. She didn't think it would keep going, but apparently it starts like the whole forest on fire. So not only does she have this ghost killer, she's got this fire going on eventually at the end of the book as well. And she, at the end of the book, runs to a dam to try to open the dam to put out the fire, because in the past, when the town has had a fire before, that's what they did and it worked. So she's like, I'm gonna go to the dam, I'm gonna open it. And while she's up there trying to open it, she actually sees an aggressive bear, and she's like, well, I actually didn't believe that was real. I thought it was fake, and there actually is an aggressive bear. And that's actually a huge part of like the last final pages. But I think it's supposed to just be symbolic and represent that she wanted someone to fight for her, because her mother wasn't fighting for her. And she sees this mother bear with a cub, and that she's defending the cub from an aggressive bear. And so it's this representation that that's what Jade really wants and needs. We'll talk about a movie shortly that's referenced to this, but there's a scene in the book where after Letha confronts Jade and thinks that she's sexually abused, they go to see her mother. Her mother works at like a Dollar General, and the sheriff's like, well, if you weren't sexually abused, your mom will say something. Her mom actually makes up a reason for why she took her daughter to a doctor out of state, or out of town, if you will. Because Letha was suspecting that Jade might have been sexually abused and impregnated, or needed to be tested in some way. And so the mom denies it and says that she had attempted to overdose on baby aspirin, so she brought her to the hospital. The actual truth is her mom just looked around for things on the counter at the checkout lane and then basically came up with a random explanation. And she was actually being abused. And that's where we're going to talk about Kaiser Sose, because that's a movie reference. That's what's believed, is that this ending with the bear is this relationship with her mother represented and what she really needs and wants. Then the third. So you've got the bear, you've got the ghost, and then you have an actual murderer. This is why this is confusing. And this is why, like I said, it's hard to talk about this book. So everything that happened with Letha and Theo. So basically there was the cave, like I mentioned, that they found in the foundation, where the worker was injured and ultimately he died after kind of being possessed. The head founder, which is, I believe it was Deacon Samuels, who is now dead, but he was the first person to stumble on the scene. He tried to pay off the workers. I think he gave them $850, something like that, to pay them off. So it wasn't much money, but trying to pay off their silence so they wouldn't tell anyone else that the houses are being built on a shaky foundation. So eventually, $800, there it is. So Grayson eventually, like I said, went to the nursing home, and then he died, and Shooting Glasses starts to share how this is being covered up with Jade and other people in the town. Theo begins to try to kill them with a nail gun, and it references the Nail Gun Massacre movie. So he's chasing around, and actually Jade is trying to snoop around for other information. She finds dead bodies in the basement of some old houses with nail gun wounds and all of that. And then she actually sees Shooting Glasses running from him and jump in the water with Theo chasing him with a mask on and shooting the nail gun at him. And he eventually takes off the mask. That's how she knows it's him. They never said this in the book, but I'm also wondering if his behaviors were impacted by the fact that you have this ground, this somewhat spiritual ground, that maybe just like how Grayson was running around like an animal and acting possessed, that maybe this was also impacting him to be more aggressive in some way. I don't know, it's just speculation, but that's one thought that I had. And then there's a teacher, which Jade references throughout the book, Mr. Holmes, when she writes these Slasher 101 essays about horror films and the history of horror films. he's kind of an oddball teacher. He has this flying contraption that he uses to snoop around the town. It's like a little homemade helicopter. Theo really doesn't like it, and so he actually gets shot down. And at first they thought it was just his contraption just failed, but he actually was shot down by the nail gun. So Theo's been using this nail gun to shoot people and murder people. Theo attempts to kill shooting glasses, and he kind of chases him to the 4th of July party. Eventually he does kill him, but it's like kind of like this wild goose chase of one chasing the other until they can finally kill him. Alright, so this is what I was speaking to in terms of Slasher 101. So throughout the book, she's writing to Mr. Holmes, and she uses these Slasher 101 segments to talk about horror movies and her love of horror, to try to help people understand that the slasher cycle has started in the community. And she's using it to make up coursework because she technically didn't finish all of her work to graduate. So she's walking for graduation, but doesn't have all the credit yet. So one of the things that I thought was really cool in this book was all these Slasher 101 components. I just thought that they were so well researched, and I picked this one because I really like this one. The writer talks about, is it Giallo? Giallo? I think that's how it's pronounced. Giallo? Which, it means yellow in Italian, but it was this common filming practice in old Italian movies, maybe from like the 50s to the early 70s. It was more like 50s and 60s. 60s and 70s. I can think of a few in the 50s too, like the end of the 50s. But basically, it's a camera technique, and you might have seen this if you ever watched Columbo or some of these old detective shows where they just show the person's hands instead of showing the face. And oftentimes they try to wear like long sleeves, like here, so it's hard to see who the hand is. And you watch them do something sinister, but you don't know who it is. So the author talks about how this is actually the first reference to slasher films, but instead of using a mask, they're gloving hands. Michael Myers in the Halloween films, when he's shown as a child, he actually has white gloves on, and his hands, and you're looking through like his eyes, but you have these white hands. So it's believed that this is a reference to that cinematography style, that basically John Carpenter, when he directed this, really understood this Italian film style for using the hands. So another piece of this is right from the start, revenge. So a lot of slashers are all about revenge from the person who is the slasher. So I put up a couple up there in terms of like Nightmare on Elm Street. Freddy Krueger is a good example of this. Jason was drowned by the camp counselors, and it was believed that he wasn't being watched as a camper. And there's usually a couple different themes, but a lot of them are there's some type of crime that happens, or there's some type of prank or something else that the person is harmed, and so the person wants revenge. So that's something she talks about in this Slasher 101 piece as well. The typical slasher process, and we're going to get to the final girl in a second. Typically, you always need a blood sacrifice. So a lot of these movies, they always open up with some scene of someone dying, and that's like the start, the sacrifice that's needed. So this book also had that, like I mentioned, reminded me of Jaws. Scream has that, Halloween has that, even films from the 60s like Psycho, it opens up, you think that the main character is going to be her, but it's not. Another common theme with slashers is the dismissive adults. So even with Sheriff Hardy talking about when he was a young camper and they dismissed him for thinking that there was a lake ghost, it's the same thing, the same idea that adults don't listen. Some of my favorite remakes of horror films, I actually love them because the parents actually listen to their children, and it's so nice to actually have kids be validated in a film rather than, you're just making it all up. So, but typically, there's always someone, and it's not necessarily even a kid, like Friday the 13th has Crazy Ralph, so everyone just dismisses him. Oh, he's just crazy, he's the guy who rides his bike and doesn't know anything. Most things occur in a single night. It's not, when I read this, I was like, that's actually kind of true. Like, it feels like it's a lot longer when you're watching a movie, but most of them are a single night, a couple hours, something like that. The only exception I could think of was maybe like I Still Know What You Did Last Summer. There was probably a couple weeks that passed in that one. There's always a signature weapon, machete, hatchet, knife, nail gun, pickaxe, something that they use that everyone knows that that's that slasher. And obviously someone to wield the weapon, and the final girl. Final girls, they typically have cool names. That's something that Jade said. So Sydney, Ripley, Connor, Julia James. The final girl is due to resolve. So she is insistent on not dying, and she's usually a timid character that you would think wouldn't have a very prominent role because she is so timid and doesn't seem like she'd last very long. But as she kind of goes through what's happening to her in a film with the slasher, and she's encountering more of her friends being killed or people in her life being murdered, she starts to kind of get that, how I think of it, is like a sense of grit, like she just really finds something in herself to begin to fight back against this evil that's in her life. So it's this transformation of a person that doesn't seem very strong that becomes empowered through their experiences and this basically trauma that they're going through. And the final girl faces her fears and has had enough that she herself becomes a weapon. And she talks about a movie in this book where, I'm going to say it was from the early 70s, where the final girl is being attacked by some hillbilly type of mutant characters in this rural area. And the final girl actually uses her own body as a weapon and sticks her arm down the villain's throat and pulls out his heart. So it's these extreme acts of becoming the physical weapon, which I think is really cool just in terms of, again, we're going against this idea of the weak woman. And they also become a vessel for hope, for change, for something else better to come after this. Another thing that she talks about in Slasher 101s is red herrings. There tends to be a misdirection. You're trying to figure out who is that gloved hand, who is the person behind the mask. And you don't really know. And you think you know, but there's always that one person that they kind of throw in there that you're like, oh, that's who it is. And then nope, it's somebody completely different. And I put in here Scream because this is probably one of my favorite examples of red herring. Randy, the person in the green shirt there, he loves horror movies just as much as I do. And so he's originally suspected of being the Ghostface killer. And the two guys that he's talking to, Stu and Billy over there, they're basically saying, what you're talking about, you sound like you could be the slasher. Why wouldn't you be the person to be doing all these murders? And turns out that they're actually the two killers. But they were trying to deflect with using Randy. So there's a ton of movie references in this book. I actually found a cool little database that they put together images of all the movies that they could identify. I did catch a couple they were missing, so I put those in here. That's not all horror either. They have a couple other movie references as well. And I will say, understanding some of these film references is really helpful. Oftentimes it will be something subtle. They might not mention the movie name. It might be like a character name. At one point she talks about Victor Crowley, and that's from the Hatchet series. And to understand that reference, it's hard to do without the movie. I do think that it was really well done in terms of how many movies he incorporated, but I do think it's hard as a reader if you're not familiar with films. I have a couple of movies I'll put in here. So I put the link up here for this person who put together all these movies. You can actually click on the movies and see some of the references, or descriptions, and little facts about the movie. So here's some more in here. I pulled a couple of them. So this is my Slasher 101. So there's a couple interesting ones in here. I'm not going to go through all of this here, but I just thought I'd put it up. I actually considered presenting on this book instead of this one. Afterwards, after I read this one, I was like, I'll still do this one anyway. But The Ring is a pretty iconic movie for my time frame in terms of like when I was a kid. Probably like 12 around the time. Yeah, probably like 12. And the book actually was similar to the movie, but very different in terms of cultural references. So if you're looking for a really good book, this one isn't great. But there's a couple others. So I can't believe that the author actually mentions blood rage, because blood rage is this very obscure, really really just cheesy horror film from 87, the height of slashers. This is one of my favorites to watch at Thanksgiving because I think this is the only movie where someone is killed with a can of cranberry sauce and there's like a cheesy line with it and it's the best thing ever. Again, I'm not going to go into every single plot of the film just for time reasons, but this one just was kind of an obscure one that I thought was funny that the author knew about. Demons is an Italian horror film by Dario Argento. I actually had the opportunity to meet him when he came in for an autograph signing, and he's just an amazing director. The film itself it's kind of like one of those like spaghetti westerns where you have like the voiceover dubbing of the Italian actors. And I think the actual actors did their own voice dubbing, but then they had to bring in American actors because their accents were still too strong that you couldn't understand easily. But this particular film is just known for the special effects. It's very detailed, and just a lot of gore, but in a fun way. It's not necessarily blood, it's just kind of gross. So that's a fun one. This is the one I was mentioning that actually isn't in the list. I actually happened to watch this right when I was reading the book, so I'm glad I did because I wouldn't have gotten this reference. So when I mentioned earlier about the mother finding things in her surroundings to tell the police that her daughter was not being abused, that it was just an innocent reason they went to this hospital. They mentioned that she Kaiser Sosé it. And the movie Usual Suspects, Kevin Spacey plays a character called Kaiser Sosé, and they're interviewing him about the deaths of these other suspects that they had in custody previously. And basically, he looks at his surroundings and fabricates the whole story for what happened that night because he really was the killer, and he just completely makes up something. And they let him go, they believe him. And then the detective, when he realizes that he walked out, he starts looking around and realizes that he pulled stuff from the investigation room to create this story. And Kaiser Sosé is actually a Turkish word for one who talks too much, and then Kaiser was something that he pulled from like the bottom of the cop's coffee cup had Kaiser written on the bottom of it. So it was completely just made up, but I thought that was a cool reference that, again, just subtle things in this book with movies. Hatchet was another fun one that they talked about in here. I feel like it tends to not get as much publicity versus Friday the 13th. There's so many cameos from celebrities in here. It's a similar idea of Jason, where basically you have this child who was disabled that wasn't being taken care of and was basically harmed by the town. It's just a traditional slasher film, but it's just fun. It's kind of silly, and it's just over the top fun. Friday the 13th, I put this one up there because I actually did have a chance to go to Camp Crystal Lake back in October. I brought some stuff up here if folks can look at it at the end if they would like. A couple weird facts. So I put that picture up. That was the best one I could find, the top picture with the hand and the ring. So Tom Savini, which is the special effects artist, if you will, he was assigned to working on this film. It was one of his first films, and obviously it's low budget. So when they have these different sequences of the murders, it shows his hands, and obviously if you've seen Friday the 13th, it ends up being the mother at the end of the film. She does not have hands like him, and she certainly does not wear a men's class ring, but they didn't think of that in terms of continuity. And the lady who plays Pamela Voorhees, she actually said that she was concerned that people were going to think she has hairy hands. so that was kind of a random fact. And in the book as well, Jade talks about this police officer and how he's an example of the incompetence of adult figures because he can't even ride his motorcycle, and he is in law enforcement and rides a motorcycle. The reality of it is, it was a low-budget film, and he actually had no clue how to ride a motorcycle. They're like, hey, can you just like get on it and look like you know how to ride it? And I'm like, okay. But that's why it comes across that way. So in terms of thinking about Jade Slasher 101, I don't know, I feel like some things are a little inconsistent if you know the history or like what went into the filming behind those things. So that wasn't intentional. That was just an accident because the person didn't know what they were doing. Popcorn. I have this DVD up there. This is one of my favorites. It was not on DVD for a very long time, and a friend showed it to me. But it's really cool because it's a modern movie, but it takes the idea of some of the concepts from like the 1950s. So I put up The Tingler here. I was a huge fan of William Castle films, like 13 Ghosts, The Tingler was one of the other common ones I like to watch from him. But he had this idea of perceptive vision, which is basically where you're in the theater, but the movie kind of comes to you. There's sensory things. Your seat vibrates. The Tingler actually can go underneath the theater chairs, and people think that it's in the crowd. So he had this idea of making the movie come to reality. And so Popcorn, as a film, it's a bunch of kids putting on a fundraiser with movies, and they have these old props from Percepto times where they can make the movie come alive. So there's the giant mosquito at the top. They have this giant mosquito film that they show, and the mosquito comes through the audience. So it's just really fun in terms of just engaging people in the film. And kind of like this throwback to Lolitta. Popcorn, it's really good. Yeah. And it's not too gory though either. It's very subtle. It's really good.
Anything with mosquitoes come through.
This one I threw in there because he also mentioned this one. And I remember watching this one with my dad when I was a kid. So 1979 Prophecy. Basically, there's a conflict between a logging mill and a local Native American tribe. And the tribe believes that their water supply is being poisoned by the logging company. And they send in this couple who's main characters to figure out the whole situation and fix it. And they end up finding mutated wildlife, especially angry mutated grizzly bears. And I kind of cut off my picture a little bit. This little picture here, it was a tadpole, but instead of being small, it was massive. So it's all just mutated wildlife. However, I brought up this film because one of the things with just my love of horror and watching different documentaries and things, horror oftentimes reflects the culture of the time. So a lot of these films, if you look at the year and what was going on at the time, you can find elements of current affairs, basically. So I put up this picture because I remember this as a kid, and this was around the same time as they had these ads with the Indian crying and this was around for environmentalism. So with Prophecy being a movie about environmentalism, this was matching that time frame. And I actually found this quote here talking about 1960s and 1970s environmentalism and how there was actually a really big push to promote clear water. So that was directly tied to this film. Some other things I put in there, 1920s, 1930s, a lot of early horror films focused on disfigurement, like Phantom of the Opera, trying to think of a couple other ones too, but Hunchback was another one that I came to mind. But typically this coincided with a lot of people's fears about physical injuries from folks coming back from World War I. 1950s, radiation, giant creatures, and the giant mosquitoes, giant spiders, giant ants. Anything giant was 1950s. And Tarantula, random fact, Clint Eastwood's first film was unaccredited as a jet fighter in Tarantula. And you only see his eyes, but he says like 2 lines and you know it's him. So there's a clip there, we can always watch that, but you can also just YouTube Tarantula 1950.
Sorry to interrupt. When you think about it, like
Yeah.
today would be technology.
Mhm.
There's a lot of
Yep.
horror technology
Yes.
in movies. Yeah.
Yep. And there's also a lot of spins too on current affairs, just in terms of equality and social justice as well. A lot of the films, especially Jordan Peele films like Get Out, Us, different takes on what we're currently talking about in the news media. Another example I put, 1984, one of the horror documentaries I was watching, they were heavily talking about Nightmare on Elm Street and how that film, even though it was about this burned murderer, if you will, and sex offender, it actually reflected this idea that someone's going to come back and that they're coming back, but they're harming things for the future generations, because he wasn't harming the parents for the misdoings that they did to him. He was harming their parents. And so there was things about, at this time frame, how Ronald Reagan was handling what was going to happen to future generations in terms of the economy and other things. So there's a lot of these themes that come across. I'm sure we'll continue to see this. And this is where sometimes movies get repeated too, because current affairs get repeated. So we'll see this kind of cycle through.
So is that the same thing for My Heart is a Chainsaw? Because it has a lot of
Mhm.
social justice issues
Yep.
in the book.
Yep, Yep, that's what I picked up as well, is so basically the focus on social justice, marginalization, is really reflecting what people are experiencing now and integrating that with their concept of structure. Exactly. And just random fact, I didn't put this on here, but supposedly Adolf Hitler's favorite horror movie at the time was King Kong. So, and if you think about him as a person and what King Kong represents, it gives you a lot of information. Just a couple horror facts. A lot of times we think of horror movies as, well, especially some of the earlier ones in the 80s, they oftentimes have this virginity thing where if you're not a virgin, you get killed, which again, current affairs. So I think there's a lot of themes there. But actually, from the Gina Davis Institute, who they look at gender equality in movies and film, and horror is actually the only genre of film where women appear and speak as much as men. And even though horror, as I said, sometimes has a sexist and misogynistic history, which I think is more, again, reflective of the times, there actually has a role there for horror being empowering for women in terms of, again, this idea of this character being able to develop this grit and persevere through something challenging. And so this is oftentimes viewed as being something to help build motivation and ambitiousness in women. But I always see this appear and speak as often as men piece always just surprises me, because I don't think you would expect that in horror films. Overall, I did enjoy this book. I highly recommend that if you read it, that you Google some movie references while you're reading it. I read through quite a few plots for movies just to get a sense of what I was reading. A lot of times there are very subtle references, you can still kind of figure it out, but then there are some that are just much more prominent. Oh yeah, and so for the ending as well, as I kind of mentioned earlier, he leaves it kind of open-ended, and I had to go back numerous times and reread sections, and I felt like I was in a crime movie where I've got like Post-its and like string. So yes, then I was like, I don't know, I'm gonna try to present on this book, but we're just gonna see how it goes, because there's no straight linear plot, and I wish I could present it any easier, but I just can't. It's just all over the place. So. Is there one? Oh, okay. I heard that there's a final girl encounter. What was it? Final girl group therapy or something?
There is a book called that.
Yep.
Final Girl Support Group.
Yeah, that one. Yep. So, any other questions, or I don't know, anything I can answer? Yeah.
So if you've never read horror
Mhm.
genre before, would be something you would recommend for a
Ooh.
newbie?
Oh, that's tricky. I feel like that there's so many different like subgenres as well, because I read like a lot of thriller and suspense too, or sometimes it's kind of overlapping into not quite slasher, close. I will say though, the one that I referenced for The Ring in this presentation, Spiral, very good, and it's written by a Japanese author and it was translated, and it's not very scary, but it was a page turner for me, and I haven't had one of those in a very long time. And I was like, I need to know what happened to these 4 kids. I want to solve the mystery with the character, and the cultural components also made it very interesting. Just learning more about like the rural Japanese landscape and cultural differences, stuff like that. But I would actually say that one was a pretty good one, and it's not too ambiguous like this one is, where there's a lot of
So
references.
is Spiral like horror?
Yes, that's a horror.
So what about for thriller?
Oh, thriller. Oh gosh, what have I read recently for thriller? I gotta think about this. I tend to read books and then I like write them down and then put them out of my brain, but I have them written down somewhere. I feel like I read another one recently. I've also been trying to read outside my genre, so I'm trying to get rid of the things that are not that genre. What did I read over the summer that was pretty good? I feel like there was a good one. Oh yeah.
I would also recommend Grading Hendrix books because he does horror mixed with like comedy, so it's kind of a nice like get your feet wet a little bit.
What's the name?
Grading Hendrix is the author, and he's the one that wrote the book, the Final Girl Support Group.
Yeah.
There was like it's more like a softcover paperback, and not too long. This is more horror, not so much thriller, but Flip This Zombie. It's a series, but it basically, I haven't read this in a long time, like 15 15 years ago, but she still has made books in that series. But it's zombie apocalypse happens, and a husband and wife are basically working together, and their marriage was kind of iffy at times, but they're working together to get through the zombie apocalypse, and that was a really fun couple books. So, and then again, it was like I read them in like a weekend. They were so fun. So, yeah. So think about any other thrillers. Any other question? Alright. I did have some things up here if anyone wanted to look at anything. I have on a Friday the 13th book,